There are conversations that happen in rooms that history does not record, not because they are unimportant. Sometimes because they are too important, because the people involved understand, without discussing it, that what is happening between them belongs to them, and not to the public narrative that surrounds them. Sometimes because the documentation simply was not there, no tape running, no journalist present, no one with a notebook and an obligation to write it down. And sometimes because the people involved are, by temperament and by long experience, people who keep the essential things close. The afternoon Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder spent together in a Los Angeles recording complex in the early 1970s falls into all three categories simultaneously. Both men were at significant points in their careers. Ray Charles was in his early 40s, a figure so established in American music that the word legendary had begun to attach itself to his name in the permanent, slightly deadening way it attaches to people who have been extraordinary for long enough that the world has started to take the extraordinariness for granted. Stevie Wonder was in his early 20s, in the middle of the extraordinary creative period that would produce talking book, Innervisions, songs in the key of life, the records that would establish him as one of the most significant musicians of his generation. They were separated by roughly 20 years and by everything that 20 years in American music between the early 1950s and the early 1970s represented. Different eras, different sounds, different relationships to the industry, different political and cultural contexts, different ways of being a black musician in America at different moments in that America's history. And they were connected by something that almost no other two people in the room at any given moment in either of their lives shared: the specific, irreplaceable, unreplicable knowledge of what it means to make music without the ability to see. What happened when they finally occupied the same room is the story this narrative has been building toward. But to understand what the meeting meant, you have to understand what each man carried into it. Par pertoneti mai rai Cherelskar. By the early 1970s, Ray Charles had been blind for over 35 years. He had lost his sight at 7 in rural Florida, in a world that had almost no infrastructure for supporting a blind black child and very little interest in developing one. He had navigated the music industry, the concert circuit, the recording studio, the contractual architecture of American commercial music, all of it, without the visual access that most people in those environments used as their primary mode of orientation. He had built systems, extraordinary, precise, deeply personal systems for doing everything that the sighted world assumed required sight. He read music in Braille and held entire orchestral arrangements in his memory. He navigated stages by the sound of the room and the specific acoustic signature of each venue. He knew his musicians by their voices before he knew them by anything else, and he remembered those voices, their timbre, their particular hesitations, the way a voice changed when its owner was tired or uncertain or inspired, with the same completeness that sighted people remember faces. He had, in other words, built an entire parallel architecture for experiencing the world, not a lesser version of the sighted architecture, but a different one, with different capabilities and different limitations and a different relationship to the information that the senses provide. This architecture had produced some of the most emotionally precise music of the 20th century. It had also produced, as a byproduct, a quality of attention that the people who worked with Ray Charles consistently described as unlike anything they had encountered elsewhere. He noticed things. Specifically, he noticed the things that sighted people, relying on visual information, tended to overlook: the hesitation in a voice, the change in a room's acoustic when someone new entered it, the specific emotional quality of a silence. He was 41 years old in the early 1970s. He had been building this architecture for 34 years. He was, in the specific domain of navigating the world without sight, as experienced as it was possible to be. And then he walked into a recording complex and heard, for the first time at close range, the voice of a man who had been building his own version of the same architecture since birth. Part TWO. Audi Sua Stevland Hardaway Morris, Stevie Wonder, was born 6 weeks premature in 1950 and lost his sight in the incubator, where excess oxygen caused retinopathy of prematurity. He had never seen anything. Not a face, not a color, not a shape. The world had been sound and touch and smell and taste from the first moment of his consciousness, with no visual layer at any point in his life to serve as reference or comparison. This was categorically different from Ray Charles's blindness, and Stevie Wonder understood the difference with clarity. Ray Charles had spent the first 7 years of his life accumulating visual memories: the faces of his mother and his brother, the landscape of rural Georgia and Florida, the specific colors and shapes of the world he had inhabited before the dark arrived. Those memories had become part of his interior landscape, part of the raw material his mind worked with when it worked. He had lost sight, he carried its memory. Stevie Wonder had nothing to lose and nothing to remember in that sense. The world had always been sonic. Music had not been a replacement for visual experience. It had been, from the beginning, the primary medium through which experience organized itself. He had not adapted to blindness. He had simply never known anything else. The music this produced was different from Ray Charles's music in ways that went beyond style and era and genre. Ray Charles's music carried the specific quality of someone who had learned to translate between two worlds, who knew what the visual world contained and had found ways to access its emotional register through other means. His music had a quality of longing in it, of reaching, that came from knowing what was absent. Stevie Wonder's music had no such translation layer. It was not reaching toward something unavailable. It was fully present in the world it had always inhabited, expressing that world with a completeness and a specificity that required no reference to what he could not see. His harmonies, his rhythmic complexity, his melodic invention, all of it came from a mind that had never divided its attention between the sonic and the visual, that had given everything to sound from the first moment. By the early 1970s, Stevie Wonder was 22 or 23 years old and in the middle of renegotiating his Motown contract, a negotiation that, in its insistence on creative control and master ownership, had certain structural similarities to what Ray Charles had done with ABC, Paramount a decade earlier, though Stevie arrived at the negotiation through a different path and with different tools. He was young. He was extraordinary. He was in the middle of becoming something that the music world had not yet fully understood, and then he found himself in the same building as the man who had invented, without naming it, the template he was following. 2-part TRES Byng T Corridor. THEROM. The specific circumstances of how Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder came to be in the same Los Angeles recording complex on the same afternoon in the early 1970s are not documented in any way that allows a precise reconstruction. What is known, through the accounts of people who were present in the building that day, recounted in various contexts over the subsequent decades, is that both men were there for separate recording sessions, that their respective teams were aware of each other's presence, and that someone, it is not clear who, suggested that the two men might want to meet. The suggestion was accepted by both. What followed was not a formal meeting. There was no arrangement of chairs, no moderator, no agenda. Two men walked into the same room, a smaller room off the main corridor, not a recording studio but a kind of common space with a piano in it, which may or may not have been coincidental, and were, for a period of time that the people outside the room estimated at somewhere between 2 and 3 hours alone together. No recording was made. The people who had arranged the introduction waited in the corridor and did not enter. At some point, someone opened the door briefly to check whether anything was needed, or simply from the ordinary restlessness of people waiting, and reported afterward that both men were at the piano, not performing, not demonstrating anything to each other, playing together, in the exploratory way of musicians who are finding out what the other person hears. Then the door closed again and the corridor went back to waiting. T pertiafoure? Het tydd not sar. The people who spoke about that afternoon in the years afterward, musicians, producers, people who had been in the building, tended to focus on what the two men had in common: the blindness, the genius, the significance of their respective contributions to American music, the particular quality of the music each had made from a position of not being able to see the world that music was going out into. But the people who understood Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder most deeply, who had worked closely with each of them over extended periods, tended to say something different. They tended to say that the most interesting thing about the two men was not what they shared, but what they did not. Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder had arrived at music from opposite directions of the same absence. Ray Charles had come from loss, from a world he had seen and could no longer see, from visual memories that informed without being available, from the specific emotional register of someone who knew what was missing because he had once had it. Stevie Wonder had come from completeness, from a world that had always been fully present to him in the terms available to him, from a sonic experience of reality that had no gap in it, no absent layer, no sense of translation required. This difference was audible in the music. Ray Charles's voice reached. Stevie Wonder's voice inhabited. Ray Charles's arrangements carried nostalgia, not for specific places or times, but for the deeper thing that nostalgia reaches toward, the sense that something real and valuable once existed and cannot be fully recovered. Stevie Wonder's arrangements carried presence, immediate, complete, the full weight of a consciousness that is entirely where it is. Neither quality was superior to the other, but they were different. And two men who had each spent decades developing their respective versions of the same fundamental adaptation, navigating music without sight, found themselves, in that room with the piano, in conversation about those differences for the first time. What Ray Charles said to Stevie Wonder about what it was like to lose sight at 7. What Stevie Wonder said to Ray Charles about what it was like to have never had it. What each discovered, in hearing the other speak, about the version of the experience they had not lived. These things were not recorded. They were not reported, they were in the specific way of things that happen in rooms that history does not document, simply lived, fully and completely, in the moment, and then carried forward by the two men who had been there, in the music each of them continued to make afterward. But the music afterward was different. People who knew both catalogs deeply enough to hear it said so. Something had shifted, subtly, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. But present, the conversation had happened. And conversations, when they are real ones, leave marks. T part 5e Miech Hiroito Ray Charles left that building with something he had not had before he entered it. He had spent his entire adult life as the primary reference point for himself and for the people who worked with him, for what it meant to make great music without sight. He was the example. He was the proof of concept. He was the man who had done it first and longest and most completely in the most public way. Stevie Wonder had given him, in that room, something different, the experience of being in the presence of someone who had done it differently. Not better or worse. Differently. Someone for whom the fundamental condition was not loss, but simply the condition itself. A different relationship to the same absence, a different music arising from the same source. What this gave Ray Charles was harder to name than a lesson or an insight. It was more like a recalibration. The sense that what he had built, the decades of systems and adaptations and navigational strategies, was one version of something that had more than one version. That his way of being in the world without sight was not the only way. That there were things about the experience he had not known because he had not lived the other version of it. He had always been the elder in any conversation about this. He had always been the one with more experience, more years, more distance traveled. Stevie Wonder was the first person he had encountered as an adult and who had been navigating the same fundamental condition from birth, and whose navigation had produced music of comparable weight and significance through an entirely different route. Stevie Wonder left the building with something different. He had grown up knowing Ray Charles's music in the way that everyone who cared about American music knew it, as a given, as part of the landscape, as one of the things that had already been done before he arrived. He had not, until that afternoon, known Ray Charles. The music and the man were, as they always are, not the same thing. What he encountered in that room was a man who had built everything he had from loss, from the specific, personal, irreplaceable experience of a world seen and then taken away. This was not Stevie Wonder's experience. He had never seen anything to lose. But hearing Ray Charles speak about it, hearing the specific quality of what the loss had installed in him, the reaching quality in the voice that was the direct sonic result of knowing what was absent, gave Stevie Wonder access to an emotional register he had understood from the outside without ever having understood from the inside. The music he made in the years immediately following that period, the run of albums from Talking Book through Songs in the Key of Life, contains, in the assessment of people who listened to it carefully, a quality that was not as fully present in his earlier work, a quality of reaching alongside the presence, of longing alongside the completeness, as if something that had been available to him only intellectually had become, after that afternoon, emotionally available as well. Whether this came from that specific conversation is impossible to document. Music does not submit to that kind of precise causal accounting. But the conversation happened, and the music changed. And the direction of the change was the direction of Ray Charles. Part 6. WHTA Sheld. There is a version of this story that emphasizes the historical significance. Two of the greatest musicians of the 20th century in the same room, on an afternoon that was not documented, producing a conversation that influenced music that millions of people would carry through their lives without knowing its origin. That version is true, but it is not the most interesting version. The most interesting version is simpler and more human. Two people who shared a condition that almost no one else they knew shared, finally in the same room, talking about what that condition actually felt like from the inside. Not performing for an audience, not building a legacy, not being legendary, just two blind men at a piano, finding out what the other person heard. Ray Charles had spent decades being asked by sighted people what it was like to make music without sight. He had answered those questions with the characteristic economy and precision of someone who has been asked something so many times that the answer has become polished. Accurate but contained. True but not fully open. Stevie Wonder was not a sighted person asking what it was like. He knew what it was like. He knew his version of it completely and from the inside. And he was asking not as an interviewer or a journalist or a curious observer, but as someone who genuinely needed to know whether Ray's version was the same as his or different. And if different, how? That question, asked peer-to-peer from one version of the experience to another, is a different question from anything Ray Charles had been asked before. And it produced, apparently, a different kind of answer. What the answer was, we do not know. What it produced, we can hear. EPIO Geek. The Musasitatcam after our Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder did not collaborate on a recording in any formal or released sense during this period. They crossed paths again over the subsequent decades, in the ordinary way of people who occupy the same professional world and have enough mutual respect to acknowledge each other when their paths cross. They spoke warmly about each other in interviews, briefly, in the economy both men used when speaking about things that mattered, and left the specifics of what had passed between them where they had chosen to leave them in the room, between themselves. But the music they each made in the years following that afternoon carries something that is difficult to name and impossible to prove, but that people who love both catalogs deeply enough to hear it consistently identify when asked about it. Ray Charles's later recordings have, in the assessment of musicians who have studied his catalog closely, a quality of settledness that is different from the reaching quality of his earlier work. Not that the reaching disappeared, it never fully disappeared, because it was structural, built into the voice at the level of the loss that had formed it. But alongside the reaching, something else, the settled quality of a man who has heard his own experience described from the outside by someone who lived it differently, and who has understood from that description something about his own experience that he had not previously been able to see. Stevie Wonder's music carries, from roughly this period forward, a quality of elegy alongside the presence, a reaching into the past or toward the absent that had not been as audible in his earlier recordings. The immediacy remained, but a new register opened alongside it, the register of longing, of knowing that something is not present that might have been, of making music that reaches toward something rather than simply inhabiting what is there. Two men in a room, a piano between them, a conversation that no one recorded, and the music that came after, the specific, subtle, irreversible shift in what each of them sounded like, as the only documentation that anything had happened at all. It was enough, it was, in the way of things that matter most, more than enough. The room had held what it needed to hold. The music carried it forward, and anyone listening carefully enough could hear exactly where it had come from.